Welcome to the Red Eye Hour, and you are listening to another episode of Solo Stories with Meeks. This story is called the Dan Reeves Saga Part 1. In the dead of night, the city sleeps, but not everyone is at rest. A lone figure, cloaked in darkness, moves with calculated precision. Meet our private investigator, a shadow among shadows, navigating the labyrinthine alleys and back streets. His mission? To find Dan Reeves and uncover the secrets hidden beneath the surface of his everyday life. Or is his mission more sinister? Silent footsteps echo off the brick walls as he ducks behind a dumpster, eyes scanning for any sign of movement. The faint glow of a distant street lamp barely illuminates his path, but it's enough for him. In this world, he relies more on instinct than sight. The investigator pauses, listening intently. A cat screeches in the distance, the sound piercing the stillness. He resumes his journey, slipping into the shadows once more, ever vigilant, ever watchful. Tonight, the hunt begins for Dan Reeves. The moonlight casts a silhouette of our determined investigator standing tall against the night. His expression is one of determination, a resolve to see this through to the end. With a final glance around, he walks away, his figure fading into the darkness, ready for whatever comes next. Dan Reeves is a male in his mid-40s with curly black hair, a moustache, and a black beard with grey hair down the middle of his beard. Dan Reeves is from the Midwest, and after graduating high school in the late 1990s, Dan went to college and then went on to work for the United States government. Dan was really good with math, physics, and engineering. During my career with the government, I excelled at my position. This gave me the opportunity to travel the world and to work at many military bases and installations. Some of these projects were considered top secret, and I had to obtain top security clearance to work at these places. I was sworn to secrecy by the United States government not to speak about some of the secret projects I worked on and witnessed. Dan worked for over 20 years for the government until he retired. Dan was never married, nor did he ever have any children, but he was very close with his family and friends. Dan had friends from all over the world that he met during his time working for the government. Dan loves to travel and visit some of his close friends that he used to work with over the years. Dan returned to his hometown after retiring from the government and invested in a couple of small businesses. For extra money and to keep himself busy, Dan works for a retired architect in the northern part of the county. His name is Mr. Blasky. Dan is also good with his hands and is a good craftsman, as Dan Reeves. So I'm helping the retired architect, Mr. Blasky. He is remodeling a 18th century stone home, and he hired me to help with this project. Other than that, I'm just living my life, minding my own business and being an entrepreneur. As Dan continues his quiet life, a subtle but undeniable tension starts to creep in. He notices small, unsettling things that are out of place. A car parked too long down the street, unfamiliar faces in local cafes, and the feeling of being watched. Dan's instincts, honed from years of dealing with top-secret projects, tell him something is wrong. One evening, while working late at Mr. Blasky's project site, Dan discovers a tiny, sophisticated listening device hidden in the stone wall he was repairing. His heart races as he realizes someone is keeping a close eye on him, but who could it be? The next day, Dan receives an anonymous package at his door. Inside, he finds a single photograph of himself taken just the day before. On the back, a message reads, "I know who you are, Dan. Stop digging." Dan's mind races. Who is this? He decides to reach out to an old friend from his government days, someone who might have the resources to help him. He contacts Butch, a former intelligence officer, and arranges a secret meeting. At a secluded diner on the outskirts of town, Dan meets Butch. They speak in hushed tones, exchanging information. Butch agrees to look into it, but warns Dan to be extremely cautious. "This is serious, Dan. Whoever is after you has resources and connections. Trust no one." As Dan drives home, he can't shake the feeling that this is just the beginning. The mystery is unraveling, and Dan is caught in the middle of it. Little does he know, this is only the start of a dangerous game where every move could be his last. With paranoia setting in, Dan decides to take precautions. He changes his routines, avoids using his regular phone, and keeps a low profile. But as days turn into weeks, the sense of being hunted grows stronger. The cat and mouse game has begun, and the stakes are higher than Dan could have ever imagined. Who is behind this? And what do they want from Dan? The answers lie deep within his past, in the secrets he thought were long buried. But now, they are coming back to haunt him. Now Dan gets more information of this private investigator being in town and that he is asking questions and trying to find him. Dan has heard through the grapevine that he has been showing up at family members' and friends' homes asking questions. This has Dan very concerned and now is wondering if his safety is at risk. He has no idea why a PI would be after him. Dan's paranoia kicks in and he starts wondering if it has something to do with his time in the government and the secret projects that he worked on. But Dan does not want any part of that. Dan has tried to forget about the things he witnessed and worked on while in the government, and when he visited some of those top secret bases, as Dan Reeves. So I start making short videos on my cell phone to document what is happening with this private investigator. That way, if something happens to me, we will have video documentation. I send the videos to some of my friends as a way of communication and to keep a timeline of these events. P.I. Sanders also has a set of skills and is resourceful, just like Dan is. But P.I. Sanders seems to have a dark side to him. The P.I. obtains Dan Reeves' phone number and starts sending Dan videos as P.I. Sanders. The videos are of me talking to Dan and letting him know that I am on his tail and that he can't get away from me. I inform Dan that I have infiltrated his inner network of contacts and that he needs to watch his back. As the weeks go by, Dan Reeves and P.I. Sanders play a very skillful game of cat and mouse. The game is starting to grow darker, and the intentions of the P.I. are going from investigative to deadly. Dan's paranoia and trust in others is fading. He hates that he has to constantly watch his back. Dan is reaching out to friends and borrowing different vehicles and staying at friends and family members' houses to throw off the private investigator. A friend from Dan's old church sends Dan a video on his phone, letting Dan know he was approached by a private investigator. A Mr. Cunningham from the Family View Christian churches who reached out to Dan.
Now, you know I'm a very Christian and peaceful man, and I would never think of hurting anyone or breaking any laws, so this was quite concerning for me. Dan, I wanted to let you know that a private investigator came by the church asking about you.
Mr. Cunningham just leaves a short message telling Dan he could not provide much information to the private investigator because he has not seen Dan in a long time.
The church will pray for you at the next worship service, but if you are in trouble, please reach out.
Mr. Cunningham's message is filled with concern and worry, reflecting his deep care for Dan's well-being. Next, Dan receives a message from an old girlfriend named Tammy. Dan and Tammy go back a long ways and were once involved romantically, but that was years ago. But they have always remained friends. Let's just say Tammy makes her living working the streets, if you know what I mean.
Hey Dan, it's Tammy. I need to warn you about something. A private investigator approached me one evening when I was out working. He was aggressive, really forward with his questions, and demanding. I'm worried about your safety, Dan. After this run-in, I'm going to be laying low for a while. Please be careful.
Over the next week or so, Dan responds to his friends that sent him videos and replied to them.
Hey everyone, I've got a lot going on right now. It's best if we avoid contact for now until all this blows over. I don't want to drag anyone else into this weird situation with the private investigator. This P.I. Sanders has shown up and caused a disturbance in my life, and it has made you all worry, and I am sorry about that. If the P.I. contacts you, just tell him you haven't seen me and you have no information. Tell him I moved away. Just make something up for God's sakes.
It was a Sunday morning, and Dan is awoken by his cell phone ringing over and over. He doesn't recognize the number, but decides to answer it to stop the call. Hello, is this Dan Reeves? Yes, it is. Dan couldn't believe what he was hearing. May I ask who is calling? This is Sheriff Hernandez with the North County Sheriff's Department. We just wanted to let you know that your friend and employer, Mr. Blasky, is missing and could possibly be dead due to foul play. You could hear the emotion in Dan's voice and the worry. Oh my God, I can't believe it. Do we know what happened? This is still an open investigation, sir. We contacted you because you are an emergency contact for Mr. Blasky, but we would like you to come down to the station and answer a few questions we have about the last time you...
Of course, whatever you need. I can come down and answer any questions. I have no problems with that. You will have to excuse me. I'm just can't believe what I'm hearing about my friend Mr. Blasky.
From this point, Dan's guts felt like they were in knots. He knew this situation with the private investigator has just been taken to another level. This is the end of the Dan Reeves Saga Part 1. This story will be continued in Part 2. Until next time, thanks for joining Solo Stories with J. Meeks. And thanks for flying with the Red Eye Hour, and we'll see you next time.